Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to this next session of our Association for Industrial Archaeology online conference. And for this Saturday, we are the theme is research, and we've got a two-part program for you. So this morning we have a theme around research that looks at the impact of COVID, and then this afternoon our young members board will be picking that up with some further presentations and discussions. So we have 4 talks for you this morning which look at the impact of COVID from the point of view of museums, voluntary sites, and the wider industrial heritage sector. And as before in this conference, we are recording these presentations, and they will be up on our YouTube channel later on for you to come back and look at. Usual housekeeping. If I could ask everybody to take their videos off, and to make sure, I know Bill said he's muted everybody. You could take your videos off so we don't have any issues with broadband. That would be brilliant. We're going to have questions after each talk, so bear that in mind. Any points you want to write down, hold those for the end of each talk, where we'll have a session of up to 10 minutes where we can deal with those questions. Zoom has a chat facility, of course. If you want to put questions or comments in the chat while the talk's going on, that will be absolutely brilliant and wonderful. And just a note on the usual housekeeping around being polite and being inclusive. We have our webmaster, Bill, has the facility to close people down and chuck them off if there are issues. So just a reminder on that. So I'm chairing this morning. I'll also be chairing this afternoon. I'm Dr. Michael Nevell. I'm the Industrial Heritage Support Officer for England. I'm also a council member for the Association for Industrial Archaeology and a past chair of the association as well. And as many of you will now realise, like all other organisations, we've adapted to lockdown and COVID, and that's why this seminar is being delivered online. I'm going to take the first slot this morning. The talks are about 20 minutes long each, and then we run into the questions. So just bear with me while I share my screen, and we'll get going. Oops. Okay. Should. Bill, could you put a thumbs up if that's okay, please? Smashing. Okay. I'm very privileged to be able to work at the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust, which of course is one of the iconic sites for the Industrial Revolution and industrialisation in the UK. And like everybody else, there have been periods over the last 18 months when I've not been able to get down to my office in Ironbridge with the 3 lockdowns. And like many other organisations, the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust has had to adapt to lockdown, adapt to the regulations, and adapt to the way in which the museum talks to its audience and maintains its buildings. And that's really a lot of the themes we will be looking at this morning. My role is really to set the scene in terms of some of the high-level impacts that we've seen as a result of COVID-19 and the lockdowns. And I'm going to do that by very, very briefly looking at how industrial archaeology and heritage is organised in the UK. Then we'll look at the mechanics of the impact of COVID, particularly the 3 lockdowns. And then I'll go on to look at some of the adaptations, some of the issues that the industrial heritage and archaeology sector have faced in Britain, and particularly in England in the last 18 months. And I also want to highlight some issues that COVID has masked, because obviously while we have COVID at the front of our minds, there's all sorts of other things going on in the background which impact the way in which industrial archaeology and heritage develops or will develop over the next few years. So just a reminder that industrial archaeology and heritage in the UK is set up in a very broad way. So we have both professional, academic and voluntary groups contributing to the research and the presentation of those industrial archaeology and heritage sites. So there's a very strong voluntary tradition in archaeology, and in particular in industrial archaeology and heritage in the UK. That goes back more than 100 years, and recent surveys over the last decade have shown that the voluntary sector continues to be quite strong in terms of archaeology volunteers. There's also the volunteer sector based in museums as well, particularly industrial heritage museums, where that tradition goes back 50 plus years. And again, that has been very strong up to the impact, the arrival of COVID. So there's over 1,000 local archaeology societies, and in England more than 600 industrial heritage sites that rely on a volunteer base in order to research and conserve and explore the industrial past. There's a very small number of academic departments in archaeology in the UK that actually deal with industrial archaeology, historical archaeology, post-medieval archaeology themes. Unfortunately, that number really hasn't changed over the last few years, and we would all wish it was larger, but nevertheless, we're only dealing with a handful of academic sites. So the other major player is the commercial archaeology sector in the UK, where we have at least 81 registered archaeological organisations registered with the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, and over 350 archaeology units, consultants and sole traders working on archaeology projects across the UK immediately before COVID hit. And it's worth bearing in mind that about a third of all archaeological activity in the UK in any given year over the last 20 years, so that's in this century, involves looking at industrial period sites. So industrial archaeology, industrial heritage, a very significant material factor on that planning professional archaeology side. My day job involves providing support and looking at research around the roughly 600 industrial heritage and archaeology sites preserved in England and open to the public. There's probably another 200 plus in Wales and Scotland, which are preserved and open to the public in the same way. But my research, looking at the impact of COVID, is based around the data I've gathered over the last 18 months from England. But I know the experience is very similar in Wales and Scotland. So the database of what I'm talking about now actually goes back to 1998, when English Heritage, as they were then, funded a survey looking at the industrial heritage sites open to the public, and that was followed up in 2008 by another survey by Sir Neil Cousins. So we have a good idea as to how those sites are organised, what kind of sites are preserved and who runs them. So very briefly here, you can see that there's a large chunk of water mills and windmills and transport sites that make up those 606 preserved sites open to the public in England, as they were at the beginning of 2020. And in terms of how they're administered, and 15% entirely run by volunteers, and another 14% run by businesses. And we have just under 10%.
Mike, you're breaking up rather badly. Seems to be a problem. I think we've lost Mike. I hope he's going to come back in a moment. Just bear with us on this one.
Yeah, of course, I will. I'll try and share my screen as well while I'm doing that, because I'm paranoid I'm not going to be able to do it properly. Has that opened up? Is that looking all right?
Yes, that looks good.
Yeah, morning, everybody. My name's John Tanner. I'm from a project manager with Barnsley Museums, where I've worked for the last kind of 13 years or so. And a lot of my time is focused on Elsecar, which is going to be the focus of the brief talk and discussion today. My brilliant and close colleague, Dr. Tegwin Roberts, who many of you will know, is also here. We thought it'd be easy if I just worked through the presentation, if that's okay. But then Tegwin will be here in the chat for any questions. And Tegwin, if you could jump in with anything that I miss, any omissions, or if I fail to acknowledge anybody that I should do, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. And obviously, I'm hoping that Tegwin will join us for the discussion at the end of the talk as well, if that's okay. So the focus of the talk today is on Elsecar, which is an incredible village we're all very passionate about for reasons which I hope will become evident. We have a wider suite of sites. Let's try to get that to load. We're Barnsley Museums. We are part of the local authority, and we've got a whole number of different museum sites and heritage sites, which I just mentioned very briefly with reference to their kind of industrial heritage links, if that's okay. Cannon Hall, which is a Georgian country mansion with kind of huge park and gardens, which was also the home and the centre of this Spencer ironmaking syndicate in the 17th and 18th century, spanning much of Yorkshire. We're responsible for Barnsley Main Colliery Headgear, which is there on the left. Absolutely extraordinary building, which we had listed and protected a few years ago. Worsborough Mill, 17th century working water mill on the top right. We've got an art gallery, we've got our social history museum, which we opened a few years ago, which is there in the bottom left. Fantastically, that's up for Museum of the Year this year. There's a whole trainload of Yorkshire folk going down on Tuesday for the awards ceremony, but that does mean that Tegwin and I have been dashing around because of the Museum of the Year last few days, so I do apologise if any of this seems slightly rushed and put together. And we're also building a number of new museum units in a new shopping complex, which is being built in the centre of Barnsley. But anyway, so Elsecar, if I may, which we'll focus on for the rest of the presentation. So where is Elsecar? It's a village. It's halfway between Sheffield and Barnsley in South Yorkshire. I guess in industrial heritage terms, it may well be most known, and certainly was most known for this, which is the Elsecar New Colliery, and the Newcomen type beam engine, which is there, which was built in 1795, and it's an extraordinary engine. We now work it using hydraulics, and the engine was rescued. I think the phrase we seem to be using is rescued and conserved between 2011 and 2014 in what was an incredible project for us all to be involved in. I couldn't see everybody's names as people entered, but certainly saw a number of people who were absolutely critical to that process of this engine still being with us and still being so looked after and shared with thousands of people each year, or at least it was before COVID. Not least Keith Falconer, Jeff Wallace, and I'm sure others who were here whose names I didn't see as we were coming in. The conservation of that engine and the wider New Colliery was a massive turning point for us in Elsecar. It started off a process of research and utterly transformed understanding of what the village is all about, what it represents, and what is a truly it's an astonishing array, variety, and extent of extant built heritage and archaeological sites. That started with local volunteers and kind of people starting to get a sense that we could be sitting on something rather important. There's a wonderful AHRC partnership, resulting in a PhD, collaborative PhD with the University of Sheffield. And then that understanding has been brought together and utterly transformed over the last 4 years or so by our Heritage Action Zone project in partnership with Historic England, which Tegwin led brilliantly. And it was fantastic for us at Barnsley Museums, and that support from Historic England, which truly did transform how we understand the village, but also how we understand its potential for the future. How do we see Elsker now? We understand it to be an industrial model village, if you like, in terms of potentially one of the first contemporary New Lanark originally. It was built by the aristocrats of Wentworth Woodhouse, a huge country house that's just a mile or so away. And Elsker is now seen as being quite a unique, possibly entirely unique example of the old order, the old power, the aristocracy taking on the Industrial Revolution. But they did so not by investment, not by giving over land. They did so by building from scratch, pretty much, a new village, a new estate village. So what Elsker can be seen as being is an almost traditional estate village in terms of the relationships, but this was one that was devoted to industry with 2 huge ironworks, multiple collieries and workshops that you can see there. I don't know, Bill, can you see my cursor at all, Bill? Or anybody?
Yes, yes, I can.
Yes, you can, John.
Thank you. So this is just the core of the village. I should have got a wider picture, to be honest. I don't know if Tegwin's got one to hand, she can share in the chat later or what have you. But this is just the core of the village to point out a few things. Our canal used to come right down to here. This later became a huge array of railway sidings. Our canal still survives further down. This is a new colliery with the new coming just out of sight. This was the original Elsker Ironworks. We had another huge ironworks about 3/4 of a mile up the hill. But this was Big Elsker Ironworks. This was our rolling mill, built 1850. Beautiful big archway entrance that was used from the original lane here. And what we have here, and again, I should have brought a photograph of it or a beautiful scan that Tegwin had commissioned. This is a huge furnace bank, which is absolutely astonishing. So all this, including blown engine houses here, is all extant structure, and it's just an absolutely astonishing structure. This area here is workshops. They went with Woodhouse Estate, incorporated various ironworks and workshops. In 1849, they decided to consolidate all the support industries, blacksmiths, joiners, everybody you can imagine, were all centralised to these beautiful workshops with a huge towering tower. As part of the Heritage Action Zone, not only was the understanding of all this transformed, but much of it is now protected. We had a very small scheduled entry monument. We now have a huge one here. This has been extended, and we have a new scheduled entry monument at Hemmingfield. And most of the buildings that you can see in the core here are now Grade 2 style listed, which is excellent news for us, and indeed for the heritage of the village. There's that increased understanding of the built heritage of the village, but also the stories of the village, and they stretch going back to the 18th century all the way up to the 1980s in terms of its industrial heritage. Elsker seems to tap into all different manners of kind of moments in terms of the industrial history of the 18th, 19th century. Things like Queen Victoria being taken out to see a column of Elsker coal, especially at the Great Exhibition. Mark Brunel had bridges built there. We now know, I think we've pretty much got the proof, that a large proportion of HMS Warriors, the Royal Navy's first ironclad, a large portion of the armour was rolled at Elsker. And that's an image from 1912 of the King going underground at Elsker. But back in 1828, King William IV, or rather Duke of Clarence as he was then, was, I think, the first member of the royal family to ever go underground, and he did so at Elsker Old Colliery. And of course, our stories, the significance of Elsker comes right up to the present day, or certainly to late 20th century. And there you can see a picture of full-on outcropping in front of Elsker Main Colliery during the miners' strike. That photograph was taken in 1984. So moving forward, where were we on the eve of all the kind of slightly terrifying and disjointed times that we've seen over the last year and a half? The previous years at Elsker had seen a big kind of turnaround and upturn in fortunes for the site in terms of huge visitor footfall. We were pushing well past 500,000 people per year visiting. As part of our Great Place partnership, with Wentworth Woodhouse, supported by the Arts Council, National Arts Heritage Fund and Historic England. We were running big events, big engagement campaigns. We mentioned the Heritage Action Zone did a huge variety of wonderful engagement to transform and engage people with the heritage. Our big Ironworks rolling mill, which is now part of the Schedule Entry Monument and Grade 2 star listed, was full to the brim every single weekend with weddings, events, maker fairs, etc. And we have about 45 commercial tenancies on site, and that, as would prove crucial during COVID, was our main income stream. You can see one of our carpenters, a sustainable carpenter and wood designer there, Sai, in the bottom left. And then, as it did for all of us, everything went in a very different direction. Obviously everything stopped with lockdown, as it did for all of us. We locked the gates. A couple of businesses were able to stay on site. We've got a small natural foods shop and they were able to stay open. But on the whole, everything else stopped, at least for those first few weeks. And obviously there was a lot for people to respond to, as there was for us all as individuals, heritage organisations, and much else. Looking back over those last 18 months, I've kind of picked out a few kind of minor points of discussion. Again, Tegwin, please do kind of shout with anything that I've missed. In terms of the slides, I guess they're kind of slightly crudely split between kind of positives and negatives, and that's slightly crude way of putting it because it's not that black and white at all. But it gives us a bit of a kind of framework, I guess, to kind of discuss a few things. There was obviously an issue with sustainability in terms of all that income suddenly stopped, or most of it did. But having said that, we're in a very, very different situation to many other people, and we fully recognise that. We're part of the local authority, which meant that rather than our staff being furloughed, they'd be moved to other duties, or we'd be in a position where we could use them to do other things. And similarly, our business model is based very much on those 40 commercial tenancies. Don't get me wrong, that all the other forms of income generation are crucial, but those business tenancies are the crucial ones. And because of government support and local government support, all our business tenants managed to pull through, which of course meant that the rental income for us pulled through. So sustainability hasn't been as much of an issue for us as for others. Volunteers, I really can't say how much we've missed our volunteers in a whole host of ways. Personally, what they've brought to the site has been very, very obvious in lots of different ways when they haven't been with us. And I think they very much missed Elsica as well, and very keen to start getting back involved again as they are doing. That's also linked to, and I'll jump forward just a bullet point there, to the deterioration of our historic buildings and structures, just through lack of use, lack of attention, projects being put on hold. Simply in some cases, for example, the new Collier Engine House, simply not getting in there on a regular basis, and our volunteers not being able to get in there every fortnight or what have you, meant that there was a very clear deterioration in certain key specific ways. But I would say we're very, very grateful to Historic England for securing a emergency heritage at risk grant for the new colliery, the works which are being currently completed at the present time, which are making a huge difference, or enabling us to kind of fight back against that deterioration that we saw during kind of the lockdown. But similarly, in terms of some of our structures, our archaeological structures, so for example, the Ironworks bank and the engine blowing house, we're working full pelt to try and establish ways forward for those with monitoring, looking to get support to consolidate those structures, and they are absolutely incredible, almost like a mini Blenhaven or medium-sized Blenhaven in terms of engine back. That all went on hold. We're picking that back up again now. I think physical engagement in terms of with our visitors, particularly in terms of being able to do tours, take people, get that Newcomen engine going up and down, being able to demonstrate it, being able to do those tours around the village or around our industrial kind of assets. It's just, they had to go on hold. And although, as I'll mention in a second, our teams did absolutely incredible digital work, I think everybody would agree that the difference, there is a fundamental difference between doing things digitally and online and doing things face-to-face, especially when those things that you want to be doing face-to-face are surrounded by such incredible industrial buildings or in incredible archaeological sites. Momentum great, I guess, in a whole host of ways. I mentioned some of that fantastic engagement through the Heritage Action Zone in Great Place. All that went on hold. We're looking to how we can pick up some of that forward planning, went on hold, those partnerships, things like, and Mike and I touched upon this, is, you know, big ambitions about the way in which we can take forward the Erie route in Yorkshire again. That was starting to come back online before lockdown, and that had to go on hold. And also huge pressure on an amazing staff team. Our site team at Elsker have been there all the way through, trying to look after the place, trying to keep people safe. And they've done an incredible job, and they've done that in very, very difficult circumstances. And of course, they've done that in the context of all the rest of us not being there, instead being sat at home and what have you for the majority of the time. Again, I'm kind of reluctant to kind of describe these as positives in any way, because I think that's kind of too crude a distinction. But I guess opportunities, or kind of plus points, or however we want to describe it. During COVID, what we have seen is very, very high footfall. We've seen that across our I've just been muted, I think. Is that right? Or can you hear me?
I can hear you again now. Sorry, finger trouble at this end.
So I think what we saw was that people basically, people's routines were broken. They stopped going to the places they were necessarily always used to go to, and they looked around at local places again and saw where they hadn't go to. So although we had lots of our visitors from further afield and regionally, nationally, those numbers went down. What we did see was local people were using Elsecar and valuing it more and more and more. And we did literally see it on green heritage space and our outdoor spaces like Carnall, Worsborough and Elsecar. In many respects, it was almost like a bank holiday every day in terms of footfall, even though on many of those days the buildings were closed or there was not very much going on. We digitized hugely in terms, we mobilized hugely on digital. We created a team across Barnsley museums, and we absolutely went for it. I've got a few kind of pictures on the following slides to demonstrate, just to kind of illustrate some of these things. To make COVID times, the lockdown, more bearable for individuals, to give opportunities for people to get together, creating virtual pubs, Christmas concerts, a whole host of other things, and things around archaeology, and specifically linked to Elsker, which I'll come back to in a minute. I think one of the big things for us is, as I mentioned, individuals and families and people were forced to take stock on what they did and what they were doing and what they were used to doing. I think that's one of the big things for us, in terms of, with everything on hold, you sit there and you rethink everything that you do, what you're thinking about for the future and how you do things. And we've certainly done that, I think, and there's lots of kind of exciting plans coming together, including us there around for the future of our historic assets and green spaces and historic spaces and archaeological sites, and what we can do with them, how we can ensure the sustainability of Elster going forward, and how we can maximise it, not just in terms of profile, because it's always been fairly hidden away and not that well known, and certainly boosting that, but also critically, and I think this is probably the major deficit we have at Elsecar, is in terms of making sure that those who come there really understand the place, can explore it, can engage with it fully. So we've been really looking at that, and have been going for it, and we're hopeful of securing funding over coming months and years to really make the most of the place and make it make sense to people, because it is a very complex place. The heritage is astounding. The industrial heritage is absolutely extraordinary, or I think so anyway. But at the moment, as a visitor experience, it's not entirely, you know, it's difficult to understand, and slightly rough around the edges. What there also has been from all those ideas that come together during COVID, those are new ideas for the future and going digital, new projects and impetus for things that we'd not really thought about before, or we thought about, but we've been able to take forward on the scale that we never kind of would have dreamed of. And I've got from the digital to the streets there, but, you know, just take a couple of examples, which I've got a couple of images to show you in a second. Things like creating a vast digital model of Elsecar, which I'm going to give you a glimpse of in a second, but I would really appreciate it if, for the time being, at least for the next few weeks, if none of you could mention to anybody else that we're working on that, because we haven't gone public on it. And that's on the back of the fantastic research of the Heritage Action Zone. So things on the streets, in terms of, we're planning a big oral history project with our former miners, as we hit a crucial stage in terms of those miners who's finished work at Elsecar in '83. And things like big joint festivals to celebrate our heritage and industrial heritage and the heritage of the surrounding area. So just, for some reason, it stopped letting me move on. I don't know if it's because I was muted, Phil. Oh, here we go. So just to mention a few of the spaces and a few things we're looking at, these are basically just to illustrate some of those quick points that I made then. So you can see there's one part of our big wonderful ironworks rolling mill there, which has been used as a storeroom for many years of various sorts, but we think it's got huge potential to do exciting things with. Obviously, fitting to its historic fabric and also its status as a Schedule Ancient Monument and Grade 2 style listed building. The space on the top right is one of my favourites, and again, it's been locked up and not used for anything for decades. We think it's originally a workshop of some kind, hence the windows on the top floor. We think it's probably the oldest building surviving of the ironworks, so predating all the changes of the 1840s, early 1850s. And again, we think it's got huge potential for the future, same as our big open spaces. So in the bottom right, there's a big 3-story factory on there. Not historic, well, historic, but from the early 80s until recently that was reaching the end of its life. What we're now left with is all that wonderful space there where we had, there was our canal originally reached that point, opened in 1798, and that whole area is given over to railway sidings. We're looking at what that could be in the future in terms of making the most of it for the visitor experience and the impact that Elsecar has socially, culturally, and economically. We mentioned digital. This is a couple of examples that I picked out here in terms of archaeologically linked things. We had a wonderful archaeology festival, which had a whole host of aspects to it, from downloadable books to fantastic online conferences that Tegwin organised, where we had people joining from across the UK, and that we made sure we got local people to online as well. We got people digging up their back gardens. So that is my daughter. You can still see where her trench was in the back garden, more than a year on. We got families across Barnsley just playing around with very small trenches in that back gardens. And one of the focuses for conferences Tegwin organised was looking at aerial mapping and understanding and exploring archaeology in that way. And I've very stupidly inculcated a picture of not Elsecar Reservoir, but Worsborough Reservoir, which is built at the same time, one of our other sites. It gives you an idea. I think one of the most incredible things in terms of what the Heritage Action Zone and what Tegwin did was really engaging people in an extraordinary way with archaeology. And a superb example of that is with our Newcomen Boil House, our Newcomen Dig, that involved lots of young people planning it. Young people and teenagers planned the dig, mobilised on it. We worked with artists to celebrate what was happening. That was basically, we'd had a suspicion for a long time that there could be, that used to be covered in concrete, but we'd had a suspicion for a very long time that there could be something lying underneath. And there's huge remains of the mid-19th century boil houses, as you can see on the right-hand side. But has brought COVID brought the consolidation of that, put it all on hold. We protected everything, but now what we've been able to do as part of that Heritage at Risk grant from Historic England is consolidate that site, and those works are finishing now and looking extraordinary. That picture was just taken a week or two ago. So I'm not quite sure if it's possible to delete this from the recording, but no, it's absolutely fine. This is basically a teaser of something that we're going to be sharing in a few weeks' time. We haven't gone public about this yet, but we're looking forward to, hopefully with Historic England and others, what we've been able to do, thanks to the work of the Heritage Action Zone and mobilising with digital creatives and digital specialists. We've created a vast, very, very detailed digital model of the whole of Elsecar. So essentially, it may be about half a mile wide, by in total by about 2.5 miles long. It's centered around about 1880-ish. And it's a vast digital model of the whole village. What we're working on now is various fly-throughs, the animation, everything, including all the industrial processes, are going to be fully animated. And the entire model is going to be, can be used for AR, but it can also be used for virtual reality. So as well as watching films of Elsecar, how it might have been, in inverted commas, towards the end of the 19th century, people will be able to put on virtual reality headsets and actually walk around the village, walk into the ironworks, walk into the collieries, and see what was happening there 130, 140 years ago. But again, that's just a teaser, so please don't mention the fact that we're creating this vast digital model on Twitter or anything else. Would be much appreciated. And that's about it from me. So hope all that kind of made sense, but any kind of comments or thoughts would be much appreciated.
Mike, are you able to take back over the chair?
Yes, hopefully. If you can hear me Bill,
Yeah.
I'll take back over.
Okay, yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
Good. Not sure if my video's working, but hang on, let's just try. Yes, back on. Right. Okay, so thank you, John, for stepping in there. I think we've all come to appreciate how temperamental online meetings and presentations can be during lockdown. So we just had a graphic illustration there. So many thanks for stepping into the breach, but also it does demonstrate how flexible this system is. We've had a number of questions on the chat, which Tegwin has fielded. Thank you, Tegwin, for doing that. I'll just quickly summarise those, if I may, before asking if there are any questions from the audience. We had a question about whether you lost any staff during COVID, and Tegwin was able to say no, you hadn't, and that your local authority have been excellent in giving support and being flexible. So that's really positive to see. And there was something else on here. Yes, lots of people very impressed with the use of Google Earth there. We promised not to tell anybody just yet what you're doing, but that's certainly a very engaging way to get across the importance of the site. So I don't know if there's anything else, Tegwin, you would want to highlight from the chat before I open it up to the floor.
I don't think so. I do think it is just worth reiterating that we've been very lucky that the local authority has recognised the importance of culture in museums in reaching people during lockdown, and the digital offer that we've been able to provide. So we've done digital before, but lockdown really supersized that. We basically had to push everything online, and the whole team worked so incredibly hard to deliver what we normally deliver face-to-face with our communities digitally, and it's really transformed what we've done and been massively successful. But we've also had big support from the rest of the authority in recognising how important that's been for our local communities. I think, would you agree with that, John?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And like I said, we're in a position, because Tegwin and I both work for Barnes and Museums, focused partly on ELSCA, but wider as well. And obviously our remit is to support people in any way we can. So while we didn't lose staff, we refocused staff on doing different things. So for example, during the course of lockdown, I think we sent just over 15,000 activity packs out, based on our collections and our historic sites, to local families, local schools, and that kind of thing. And obviously it was our learning team who are making those and literally sat at home putting them together, especially targeted at kind of, for example, families who got free school meals and that kind of thing. Families who've just come to Barnes in the last year or two, our Feels Like Home programme. Again, we did heritage focused activity with them. We even managed to get funding to give them laptops, mobile phones and mobile data so they can engage. And as Tegwin said, we were very fortunate. This sounds like it's bragging, it's not, because we were just gobsmacked about it and very pleased to be able to do it. Our digital reach is, for lockdown, hit just over 17 million, which was absolutely extraordinary. So we're very chuffed, but as Tegwin said, and I'd agree, we're very fortunate to be in a position of a very supportive local authority who is happy to kind of see the value of heritage and to mobilise it in different ways, as opposed to looking to close things down for the duration.
Right, I've got a question on the chat here that's just come from Judy Collins. She's asking how she'd like to know more about how the has worked, because normally it's focused on town centres and shop fronts, as she says, rather than industrial sites.
I think not always, actually. The recent high street heritage action zones are very much focused on town centres and shop fronts. The earlier heritage action zones, of which Elsica was one, have focused on areas of research. So with Elsica, really, it was looking at understanding that heritage landscape and what was there, but also looking at potential for that to become an economic driver for the region through tourism and through visitors and the visitor economy. So it was looking at growth very much so, but in a different way. And there's a couple, the Stockton and Darlington have a Heritage Action Zone as well that's doing a very similar thing and looking at it from a very research-focused kind of way. So there are a few of them who are looking at it. And Stoke, I think, has got a Heritage Action Zone too. She's looking at the potteries. So there's a few industrial heritage action zones out there.
Okay.
Sorry, Mike, I was just going to say, I've just popped in the chat the link to the HAA, which is a PDF that's downloadable, which is a vast, wonderful document that was put together with Tegwin and local people's support by the Historic England Research Team. It's an absolutely extraordinary document. And it's essentially not only was that transformation of understanding, i.e. not just a kind of a, thank you, Jeff, sorry, I've just seen that pop up, not just a kind of former pit village with some posh buildings because it happens to have this, but it's totally transformed it, understanding everything. But that HAA is there, and as Tegwin also said, is crucially that has given us a very firm foundation on understanding how we can use those assets and use those spaces in the future in a way that has impact and can boost the impact of what we do without being in danger of having detrimental impacts on the heritage or archaeology.
Brilliant. We've got one question from the audience. Shane Gould has got his hand up. So, Bill, if you could unmute Shane. And Shane, your chance to ask your question.
It's not really a question, Mike. It's just picking up what Tegwin pointed out, and also the question in the chat. As Tegwin says, a number of the heritage action zones do have an industrial heritage focus, and indeed some of the high streets heritage action zones do include industrial sites as well. So if you do have a look on the Historic England website, do a search under heritage action zones. You can look at them all, both the early ones that Tegwin flagged and high streets heritage action zones as well. And that's where you can pick up things like the report that John mentioned on the historic area assessment for Elsecar as well. So there's a lot of information on there. So if you want more information on that program, do have a look on our website.
And can I just pick up on Jeff's point in the chat? John and I are really lucky to work in an amazing team. We're sort of a small part of the. Barnsley Museums just has an amazing bunch of people who've worked so hard over the last 18 months. Lots of positives. It hasn't been easy, but I think everyone's really put a huge amount of effort into continuing what we do in different ways and finding new ways to do that.
Amazing people to work with. And again, I mentioned before that our town centre museum is up for Museum of the Year and it's on telly on Tuesday night. It's centred on the town museum, but it's basically focused on what all our colleagues have been doing because they're absolutely amazing.
Fingers crossed. I'm going to bring the discussion to an end at that point. Thank you very much for John for stepping in there. I think that's a really excellent case study of how a local authority-based museum has coped during COVID. And I will take a positive from that. I think there's lots of very positive and inspirational things to take out of the necessity of having to move online and find new ways to engage with your audiences. So John and also Tegwin, thank you very much for that. Right, and with Bill's, our webmaster's permission, I'm just going to step back in and attempt to finish my presentation very, very quickly before we move on to Joe Alexander-Jones from the Berkshire Industrial Archaeology Group to get a view of the impact of COVID from a local voluntary group. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this time things won't be too awkward. I'm just going to quickly do this. So, assuming, so Bill, can you see that?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. So I'm just going to very, very quickly pick up where I left off, and actually this fits into some of the discussion we were just having and some of the points John made. And the immediate impact of COVID was that all our 600 industrial heritage and archaeology sites were closed. In fact, they ended up being closed over the 3 lockdowns. Historic England, along with Cadw and Historic Environment Scotland, reissued guidance on reopening industrial heritage sites in June 2020, which of course were updated for the subsequent 2 lockdowns. If we look back at the summer of 2020, after the first lockdown, only 50% of those 600 preserved sites open to the public were able to reopen, which means half those sites did not open. In fact, half our industrial heritage sites in England didn't open between March 2020 and the summer of 2021. And in December 2020, in between the second and the third lockdown, we had less than 25% of our industrial heritage sites open, although we have to bear in mind that the winter is the down season for a lot of smaller industrial heritage sites, particularly the ones run by volunteers. So you can see this with just very quickly, these two examples, Crofton Beam Engine and the Spa Valley Railway, where they had to cope with closing, reopening, closing, reopening. Interestingly enough, like many railways, the Spa Valley Railway raised money directly from the public, while of course Crofton Beam Engine Museum had the issue of trying to maintain their engines and boilers even when the site was closed. And as we've heard from John, you know, maintenance issues on site certainly have been a factor in the impact in COVID, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So just a sort of graphic there as to where the lockdowns were and how sites reopened and closed again across that 18 months. Some of the downsides of those three lockdowns: vandalism, people breaking into sites. It's a particular problem historically with railways and with pumping engine sites where there are precious metals, well, sort of copper to steel. But we had quite a number of examples of trespass on railway lines and during lockdown, and the vandalism of information boards and Avon-Croft Museum, for instance. What of the building windows were vandalised in April 2021, literally the day after they are opened, which is really depressing. We had a number of sites actually stating in the summer of 2020 that they wouldn't open at all. Not obviously, I mentioned that there's 50% of sites did not open between March 2020 and the summer of 2021. But early on, a large number of sites said that they could not open. And in 2020, visitor numbers across industrial heritage sites were down 70%. Although we should note that some sites, particularly corn mills that were able to, that historically provided stone ground flour, did see a boom, at least in the first lockdown, less so in the second and third, in terms of demand for their product. John's mentioned the Cultural Heritage Recovery Fund, and Elsecar and Barnsley Museums were recipients of some of that funding. That's come in three tranches. The first of which was October 2020, then we had another round in February 21 and a round in April 2021. And you can see here the way in which the funds were distributed, at least in England, around the UK. And what I would highlight is that there's £50 million worth of support there, managed by Arts Council England, National Heritage Lottery Fund, and Historic England. And in the first two rounds of funding, 131 industrial heritage sites received funding, and in the third round, 72 industrial heritage sites. These are separate industrial heritage sites. Some received multiple funding for maintenance, for emergency repairs, for moving online, and also for adapting to COVID compliant visitors. But I would also point out that we had a large group of privately raised funds led by the railway heritage, the preserved railway heritage sector, who in 2020 raised over £3.5 million directly from the public, from online appeals. And between March 2020 and April 2021, there were 79 industrial heritage sites in England who had online donation calls. And that's certainly something that increased during the lockdown, and was a way of engaging with the audiences who couldn't get to those sites. Although I should also say that we're still looking at the long-term impact on volunteer numbers and the financial viability of these sites. But a shout out for Rebuilding Heritage there, as well as Arts Council and National Heritage Lottery Fund and Historic England for providing both funding and free online resources. The Industrial Heritage Support Officer project for England also adapted to the online environment. We took our 7, now 8 industrial heritage networks online from March 2020. And we also beefed up our internet presence with the 2 websites, the Facebook and Twitter, gathering data on sites that were open, sites that were using online means to engage, and sites receiving grants, also issues around vandalism, and also highlighting guidance from the Museums Association as well as Historic England and the government on being COVID compliant. All of that ending up on site, on the website. We also took the opportunity with the 7 online meetings of our industrial heritage networks to ask specifically each group about the impact of COVID. And we had we engaged with 82 people. We had 60 sites represented in those 7 online meetings between October 2020 and April 2021. You have to bear in mind that lots of sites, as I said, just didn't open at all. So the fact that we got to 60 of our sites, I think, is very positive. Range of comments here, which I will come back to at the end in a moment, which I think is very typical of the way in which sites cope with the impact and also adapted. You know, catering and shop facilities had to change. Issues with maintenance, volunteers keen to return, but numbers had to be limited. Issue around training volunteers, using open air spaces. Those are all things that came out constantly from the 7 online meetings we had as ways of both adapting and coping with problems. And of course, there's another side to the impact of COVID, which is it masks existing problems. At the forefront at the moment is, well, one of them being climate change and the impact on industrial heritage sites. Ironbridge, for instance, got flooded 3 times in 2020. Here's the big flood in February 2020, but there were 2 smaller ones later on during lockdown. Storm damage, particularly bad in 2020, but there have been other historic cases of storm damage as well. You can see the results on these 2 windmills. And then the growing issue around the use of coal for stationary steam engines and heritage railways. These are all issues bubbling under the surface, but sort of behind the issue around COVID, but issues which are certainly long-term and which we need to address. But in some ways, COVID allowed these issues to come to the surface and be thought about on their own, because so many sites were closed, that these issues gained greater prominence. And then issue of maintenance. John mentioned maintenance. There certainly are maintenance backlogs, some of which are to do with COVID, some are not. Again, the impact of COVID highlighting the issue of maintenance. There are, for instance, 3 big online appeals for Croft and Beam engines, Sept Steam Museum and Whitchurch Silk Mill, around raising monies for maintenance, and certainly for a number of those sites, COVID has made the situation worse. At Whitchurch Silk Mill, the wooden water wheel there didn't run, wooden and cast iron water wheel did not run for months and months and months, and that caused an issue with the maintenance of the wooden elements of the wheel, which now have to be replaced, reducing the lifespan of that wheel. So there are issues around maintenance which COVID has definitely made worse. So just to summarise, There are positives, there are negatives. The positives I mentioned about the watermills that are grinding grain, which saw increased demand for their products. We can see as well that there's a diversity of business models as to how our industrial heritage sites function, and that's going to be important for looking at post-pandemic working. So we have that mix of charities and volunteer-run sites and professional and commercially run sites. And in some cases, we have sites which have both a charity arm and a business arm. So I think looking at the viability of those and the resilience of those is important coming out of COVID. In online resources increased. Shrewsbury Flax Mill is a good example of that, but there are plenty of other sites where they move to providing free online resources, whether that be tours or teacher packs or other forms of online resources. But only 10% of our industrial heritage sites have online resources in the spring of 2021. So it's increased, but from a low base. And finally, online activities like this, 75% of the 60 industrial heritage sites I talked to last year and this year have said that they've increased online meetings to help train and support their volunteers and staff, and also to get out to a wider audience, and would continue to do so. So that just finishes my presentation for this morning, just trying to give you some of the highlights and overview background. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and if there are any questions on that, I'm happy to take them now, but I can see that Joe Alexander-Jones is waiting in the wings to talk about the Berkshire Industrial Archaeology Group's experience of lockdown. If there are no questions on what I've just said, and that's fine if there isn't, don't feel obliged, but if you do think of something later on, put it in the chat. I think we'll move on. So, we've got 1 point from Shane Gould before we move on. So, Bill, if you could unmute Shane for me. Shane.
Mike, is it worth just saying a little bit about the data crunching and the mapping that we're doing as well, just to get a better understanding of the evidence base on these sites?
Yes,
and what we're doing it there.
I didn't include that because it's because of time constraints, but Shane and I are revisiting the 1998 and 2008 surveys that provide the database for the sort of roughly 606 preserved industrial heritage and archaeology sites open to the public in England, and we're now mapping that and looking at sites that have opened, looking at sites that are no longer open to the public. And in fact, we've used the opportunity of the lockdown in order to do that. So come the end of the year, we will have a better idea. We will have an up-to-date list and maps on a regional basis of where all those 606-ish industrial heritage sites open to the public, where they are, who runs them, and which ones are still open to the public, and that's data which will make its way into the public domain, and which we've been feeding in, as you will hear at the end of this morning, into Historic England's new industrial heritage strategy. Does that answer your point, Shane? Hopefully it does.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Mike. Thanks for that.
Great. Right. Well, we will move on. So, Joe, you've been waiting in the background there. So I'm going to hand over to Joe Alexander-Jones, who is a member of the Berkshire Industrial Archaeology Group, to hear about their experience of lockdown and coping with COVID. So over to you, Joan.
Thank you. I shall just share my screen. Right, for those of you that you can see a beach, I'm sorry to say that is not part of Berkshire. Can you see my screen now?
No.
No. Right, what have I done wrong? Screen. Share. Can you see it?
We can
The beach now.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, not Berkshire. And now can you see industrial Berkshire?
That's good.
Good, right. What you'll find now is I'm Jo Alexander Jones, and I'm part of the committee of the Berkshire Industrial Archaeology Group. And we're definitely moving down the scale, or along the scale, to what I suspect, although I don't know, is probably one of the smallest voluntary industrial archaeology groups in the country. But we tried to make a positive out of what could have been very much a negative experience with COVID. To start with, I thought I'd better place where we are, because not everybody knows where Berkshire is. And certainly if you look at industrial books, books about the Industrial Revolution, we may feature, but normally just as a small footnote. We're in the south of England, we're a landlocked county, and we're surrounded by the likes of Oxfordshire, Hampshire, Wiltshire, and to our east, the large conurbation of Greater London, which has its benefits because we are very much situated on the east-west and north-south hubs for transporting goods around the country. And that has very much led to where we have sat with our industries in Berkshire. We've got a lot of brewing industries. We have a lot of brickwork industry. We have ironworks. We have printing. And at one time we had one of the largest printing concerns, which was Cox and Wyman, situated in Reading, which is in the centre of Berkshire. We have foods. We had Huntley and Palmer's, the great biscuit manufacturers. We had seeds, Sutton Seeds, who sent seeds and bulbs all around the world. And as I say, we had a lot of transport. We've still got the Kennet and Avon Canal. We had links into the Berks and Wilts Canal and various other canals that led all round the rest of England. And we had the Great Western Railway running straight through the county, thankfully stopping in places. And that led to a lot of industrial elements that were associated with bringing goods in, moving them around the country, making items such as biscuits, cakes and such like, and then sending them on, particularly around to London. Now, in terms of the Berkshire Industrial Archaeology Group, we started in the early 70s and grew out of what were then evening classes run by one of the local industrial heritage professionals to educate people and to bring them together, you know, people who had an interest in industrial heritage. What you can see here is one of the early restoration projects we undertook, which was a horse wheel, which can now be seen fully restored in Gray's House, Gray's Court, which is a National Trust house in what would have been Greater Berkshire, but is now Oxfordshire. And we haven't stopped being involved in maybe not so much restoration, but recording, because this month we went to the Reading gas holder. We were invited there by the owners to make a photographic record of what's left, because sadly this week they've started to knock it down. But mainly what we do now is around educating people about the industrial history of Berkshire and sharing that information, engaging with people and forming a small network for groups for people that are interested in that subject. Just to make it clear, you know, we've seen beautiful Elsa Carl, we've seen lots of other places. We have no assets. Well, not many. I'm actually resting my feet on probably what's our largest amount of assets, which is our slides and photographic collection, which is currently being scanned. And we have no paid staff. We get no funding from anywhere. But the positive in that is we get no strategies from outside. We get no politics. We can do what we want with the small amount of resources that we have. So, like most of the groups around the whole country, around the whole world, the impact of COVID was rather swift and rather devastating of the plans we had. Since the beginning of our group getting together, we'd really been focused on face-to-face activities, events, meetings, restoration, recording. Suddenly that all had to stop. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the changes that we brought in, but I have to be honest that we had already been having discussions about, we had a drop in membership and we have an aging profile, which I think is not unusual in heritage groups in general, and particularly industrial archaeology, where we found that people didn't really understand what that meant. And we had been discussing whether or not we change our name to industrial heritage. Now, I put this slide in partly because it is part of our industrial heritage. These are the iron grave markers that were used, that were produced by Hedges Foundry, which is in Bucklebury, which is in the east of Berkshire County, but also because it did feel when COVID hit that that might be all that was left of Berkshire Industrial Archaeology Group, just a little gravestone that marked where we had been. But when we sat down as a committee and looked at what was happening, we found actually there were some very positive points. We had stopped having to book the hall, so we weren't paying out for that. We had stopped paying for speakers, so we weren't paying out for that. So while we don't have a huge amount of financial capital, we weren't actually laying any out. So what we decided to do was to make membership free for 2021, both as a thank you to those members who've been with us for a long while, but also to see if we could use it as a way of encouraging people to come in, look at us for a year, look at what we did, and if they liked it, hopefully stay on. We were also lucky that we were able to borrow a Zoom license from various people at various times, which meant we didn't have that outlay of paying for that, which would have taken quite a lot of our capital. We also sat down and decided, right, we've got to increase, as we've seen with everybody, our digital footprint. So we upped the number of emails we sent, we upped the sort of content we had in our emails, because prior to COVID, the emails had really just been saying, this is where we're meeting, this is what we're doing, come along. So we changed it to informing people about what was going on, introducing them to sources and resources that they may not have had. Up in our social media, we have a Twitter account. I have to say we don't have a Facebook account because I don't quite understand how Facebook works. And as I do that, I decided not to take on something that I could make a mess of. And one of the things we did do was the Heritage Open Days. We'd always run a walk around Reading, which was very well received, but it was something that we couldn't do in the year when COVID hit. So one of our members introduced us to a Twitter conference, which was a bit scary at first, but we ended up doing a conference which was called IA in Berkshire, Our Heritage in 280 Characters. And Mike, who's hosting this conference, kindly joined in with us. And we had 4 speakers and we had a very positive reaction. I mean, we have a website which gets probably 300 to 400 hits a month. And following the Heritage Open Day Twitter conference, we had over 700 hits, and the number has continued to remain high. there has been some negative impacts of going to a more digital environment because, as I said, some of our population are rather old. We have a few members who don't have email, and it's been difficult to keep them engaged. We print out what we can, but printing out a lot of links to online services is not going to help them. So we had to think about how we do that. But I have to say, well over 90 to 95% of our group have got on with the online, got involved, and have taken to it very positively. And that includes me, because I'm not the world's best at this. So where are we now? We had our first face-to-face activity in August. We decided to start with an outdoor visit, which did include what you can see on the screen, which is one of the gas engines at the Abingdon Museum. And again, Abingdon, although it's now in Oxford, did used to belong to Berkshire before the boundary changes. And if anyone gets the chance to go there, this is a fabulous little setup. Not particularly well advertised, so you may miss it if you go to Abingdon, but definitely, if you get there, get a chance to go and see it. But we had quite a good take up. We combined it with a walk along the Berks and Wilts Canal, and we combined it with an evening meal, because a lot of what we do while we focus on industrial heritage is also about the networking and bringing people together. So when I sat down and looked at where we actually were, we've got about a 40% increase in our membership. Now, I'm not pretending our membership's very high. We started off around 40 to 50. So 40% is not huge in numbers, but it's hugely significant for us. And what we found, and maybe this is making a negative out of a positive as well, because we have to find a way of dealing with it, is that those members have grown in geographical scale. Prior to COVID, we had about 12% of our members who lived outside of the county, and most of those were people who'd retired, moved out of Berkshire and stayed in contact. We've now got over 21% of our group that are outside the county. So if we return to face-to-face meetings, they're not really going to be able to get to join in with us. So we need to find a way to keep them engaged. Now, what we're looking at obviously is mixing virtual and face-to-face meetings. But I don't know, and if anyone does know, I'd love to find out a way of actually combining a Zoom meeting and a face-to-face meeting that works effectively. Because if we don't do that, we need to either have some people missing out on certain topics, or we have to duplicate, which isn't very easy. But we are planning to record our meetings when we can, mainly our Zoom meetings. Recording our face-to-face meetings might be a little more difficult because we have a rather old church hall that we meet in. We've also looked at, do we change our meeting times? We meet in Reading on a Monday evening. It's dark, and Reading on a Monday evening may not be the place you really want to be. So do we start doing lunch meetings? Do we start doing weekend meetings? Do we start doing shorter meetings where we just meet up somewhere, have a quick look around an area, and then combine it with some form of meal or social event? So I think I could say that COVID has made some impact on us. To some extent, the impact has been to highlight some of the issues we already had with a quite low membership and an ageing membership. And to be honest, we don't have all the answers yet. And maybe in a year's time, we'll know how successful we've been in keeping our members and keeping them engaged. I would say one of the things that has been very positive for us is during this time in lockdown, we've managed to forge links with a lot of the other heritage groups in the areas, and also a lot of the professionals, both with the AIA itself, but also with people like West Berkshire Archaeology, who are extremely knowledgeable and interested in what we do, but they're 3 people and they cover prehistory to now. So we've been able to help them with feet on the ground. They've been able to help us with expertise. And hopefully that going forward, that will prove very positive. So I'm going to stop now and just ask anyone if they've got any questions or observations. If not, we'll go back to Mike.
Would you like to unshare your screen,
I
Joe?
will try. As expressed, I'm not the best with new technology. Get there in a minute. Unshare your screen.
We have a comment from Joe.
there.
Joe, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much for that. I know we have a comment on the chat from Mary Mills. Mary, would you just like to say very briefly what you said on the chat? Bill, if you could unmute Mary.
I think Mary can do that.
Or Mary, if you can unmute yourself at your end.
Yeah, just very quickly, I could say quite a bit about this. You shouldn't ignore Facebook. We have people asking to, inverted commas, join all the time and from all over the world. It doesn't mean anything very much, but it is a population, if you like, you can contact. But the Talks program on Zoom, and we get regular people from all over the world coming to listen to talks. As I said, a small part, on the scale of Greenwich industrial history, the international cables, although it's a big thing to the public, it isn't a big thing in the scale of what we've actually got. Compare it to the Royal Arsenal or something. But it is a subject on which we can pick up a big international audience and do. The website, of course, that we use all the time is run from New York. And that, is part of all this. I think we intend to stay on Zoom for talks and to not go back to live audiences. Bigger audiences and a better subject range. Our next speaker is going to be giving the talk from Glasgow.
Okay. Thank you, Mary.
Yes, I didn't mean to dismiss Facebook. One of the things I personally find is that, I run the newsletter, I run the website, and I run the Twitter account. I would also then be running the Facebook account. It takes a lot of time and effort when you're a very small group. And I just had to make a choice. Now we're trying to bring more people onto the committee to spread out some of the work, because it's not just, I find it's not just the physical work, it's the mental work of trying to think of things to share. Because as I say, in Berkshire, while we have, I believe, a lot of interest in industrial archaeology, we have very few sites. And the sites that we have are mainly housing estates now to preserve the buildings. So it's interesting, but it is quite difficult to sell a county where things are mainly hidden.
Thanks, Joe. I got one final point here from Tegwin Roberts up at Elsecar. She says that the South Yorkshire Industrial History Society have been running hybrid talks recently, and they've been live streaming the speaker, but people can also attend in person. I think I know of another couple of sites, archaeology groups, who are doing the same thing. The issue there, as ever, is having the technology. If you can afford the technology, it is possible to do those hybrid talks. But I think it's very clear that online forms of communication, online talks like this, are here to stay. So, Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, and it's great that we've been able to hear from a local voluntary group, as well as from a museum context. And this afternoon, we'll also be hearing through the AIA's Young Members Board from the professional sector as well. So the whole point about today is that, in terms of the research seminar, is that we get a rounded look at how all aspects of industrial archaeology and heritage have been coping with COVID. But of course, while we're coping with COVID, we're also thinking about the future, which is my lead-in to introduce Shane Gould. Shane, I see you've unmuted yourself, so if you want to put your video on as our final speaker for this morning. Hopefully we won't have any further technical issues. I'm going to hand over to Shane Gould, who deals with industrial archaeology and heritage, head of industrial heritage strategy at Historic England. So Shane, over to you.
So hopefully, Mike, you can see that and you can hear me.
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks for that. As Mike says, I'm Shane Gould, head of industrial heritage strategy within Historic England. And what Mike's asked me to do in the next 20 minutes or so is just to give a brief flavour of the strategy, where we are and what's being delivered and progress to date, really. So let's without further ado, we'll start with that. So whoops, where's that? Bear with me. Yeah, so in terms of the strategy itself, it went into consultation around March this year. So hopefully some of you will have seen that. But it's worth saying, before we look at the strategy in more detail, it's not been developed in isolation. Obviously, a lot of work's been undertaken on the industrial heritage, both here and overseas, and that's shaped and informed our developing strategy itself. One of the most recent being on the slide on the left there, the all-party parliamentary groups on industrial heritage's 2018 report on the challenges facing the industrial heritage sector, which some of you may recall was followed in 2019 by an industrial heritage summit held at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And again, we helped the APPG in organising that. In the centre is the former chair of the group, Nick Thomas-Symonds MP. To the left are Chief Executive Duncan Wilson, and to the extreme left is Mike, who's chairing today's meeting. As I mentioned, Nick Thomas-Symonds unfortunately had to step down due to other commitments, and the new chair is Stephanie Peacock MP, representing Barnsley East and Labour. So Elsecar sits within Stephanie's constituency. The APPG was reconvened on the 8th of June, where we gave a presentation. John gave a presentation on Elsecar, and we also had a presentation from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And we've offered to help and work with the APPG in moving forward. So hopefully that will be taken on board as the APPG reconvenes. So in terms of Historic England's industrial heritage strategy, you know, why have we prepared one? I think for this audience, we don't need to mention the international importance of the UK's industrial heritage. And as a result, those remains are of outstanding significance. But ongoing changes, especially since World War II, have led to the loss of many former industrial heritage sites. And as our 2011 Industrial Heritage Risk Project showed, England's industrial heritage remains very much at risk. On the screen now, you can see some of the media coverage from the launch of that project back in 2011. And we've got Keith Faulkner on the call, who was at that point employed by Historic England, and Keith worked very closely with me in delivering the project. So thanks very much to Keith on that one. The project identified various threats, as I mentioned. Those include functional redundancy, a reluctance within the development sector to take sites on, serious concerns over the sustainability of some industrial sites preserved as heritage attractions, which Mike's alluded to during his presentation, the challenge of addressing large, complex industrial heritage at risk, a lack of opportunities to develop the necessary knowledge and skills, understanding and appreciation at all levels, because in many ways, what we're looking at here is a history of ordinary working people. And of course, a number of those risks have now been heightened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So for those of you who've seen the strategy, or those who have not, it's broken down into 4 themes and 9 issues, as you see on the screen there. In terms of scope and definition, we're looking at 1750 to date, with an emphasis from the Industrial Revolution to the onset of World War I. We've broken it down into 4 themes on the left of the screen, which is typically how industrial heritage is categorized both here and overseas. And they're supported by 9 issues to the right. But obviously this is loose. There's connections across and within many of the issues and themes, and we don't wish to be fixated by what's in and what's out of scope. So this is a loose framework in which we're working to. What you do see within many of the issues and themes, however, is they relate to a specific area of interest and relevance to a particular stakeholder group. For each issue and theme, it sets out a vision, outlines the scope and challenges for that particular issue and theme, and then highlights a number of priority activities. Discussions have already been held with a number of sector partners with activities underway, which I'll mention a bit later on. Others are taking place, others have yet to commence. But given its scope, ambition, scale, and the finite resources within historic England, partnership working will be key to its success. As I mentioned, the consultation was launched in March, it closed in June, and we're currently reviewing the responses, including those from the Association for Industrial Archaeology. So let's look at some of these themes and issues in more detail and just give you a flavour of what's going on, because it's not the case that once a strategy is written, it's then delivered. Delivery is taking place as the strategy is being prepared. So this is issue 2, planning and conservation. And I think we're seeing a steady improvement in the way industrial sites are dealt with through the planning process. And this is illustrated by a growing number of good practice case studies. Many can be found in Heritage as a Foundation for Success, which you can see on the left of the screen. And this is an advocacy document we've prepared, highlighting the importance of the historic environment and place shaping. And again, this can be downloaded free of charge from the Historic England website. Back in 2012, we, together with the Association for Industrial Archaeology, supported the Council for British Archaeology in preparing Industrial Archaeology Handbook, seen on the right of the screen there. And this is a landmark publication which provides a valuable guide to the key building types and below ground archaeological remains associated with the industrialization of Britain. And for us, the challenge is how to build and embed this good practice. As an organization, we produce advice and guidance, such as on the screen there, Science for Historic Industries, updated in 2018, which provides advice on how to deal with buried archaeological evidence through the planning process and includes a number of case studies. Some of you will be aware of the recent archaeological work at Curzon Street Station in Birmingham, where what's being revealed is thought to be the oldest railway roundhouse and turntable in the world, dating to 1837, designed by Robert Stevenson. And discussions are underway between High Speed 2, ourselves, and other stakeholders to see how those remains can be preserved and presented alongside other aspects of the site's railway heritage. Also under this issue, we're hoping to produce an Industrial Heritage Historic England Voice Note. As John mentioned earlier, looking at the Elsecar Heritage Action Zone, we're seeking to mainstream current good practice by championing the consideration of historic industrial heritage sites through the provision of advice and other appropriate work, including our program of Heritage Action Zones. They showcase how the historic environment can be used to underpin successful place shaping by involving the public, the private, and third sector organizations. And a number have a strong industrial heritage component, as you've already heard from Elsecar, with its important remains of the coal and iron industry, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, Stoke-on-Trent Ceramic, the home of the pottery industry, and the railway town of Swindon. So here we've got the Greater Grimsby Heritage Action Zone, once the world's busiest fishing port, where a partnership between Historic England, North East Lincolnshire Council, Associated British Ports, and the Greater Grimsby Ice Factory Trust, where heritage-led regeneration is viewed as being critical to the future of the port and of the town. The bulk of our funding will be invested in a partnership scheme to repair and improve historic buildings in the Casbah, which is the image on the left. Designated a conservation area in 2017, and we're also providing advice and support to the Greater Grimsby Ice Factory Trust and partners to secure the future of the ice factory, an important building at risk, which stands at the gateway to the Casbah, shown to the right. And again, you can see from the scale and the condition, the challenges some of these larger sites can present. Moving on to issue 3, reuse. Again, a growing number of industrial buildings have been successfully repurposed to a variety of uses. They've been converted to provide homes, offices, hotels, manufacturing or workspace, and mixed uses where complementary functions can feed off each other. They're also very popular amongst the creative industries. Our Mills of the North project sits within this issue. And some of the reports here have been produced as part of that project. To the left, we've got reports looking at the evidence base, what survives, their condition, levels of occupancy. To the middle, those two reports look around issues around reuse and also contain a number of case studies. And to the right, a mainstream publication. Again, all downloadable from the Historic England website, and you see the link at the bottom of the screen. The project covers Manchester, Pennine Lancashire, and West Yorkshire, and looks at raising awareness of mill reuse, as I highlighted earlier, by publishing resources highlighting the potential of mill reuse by celebrating successful case studies and enhancing understanding for reuse projects. We're also planning 2 mill webinars later this year, so do look out for those. It includes strategic engagement. For example, working with Oldham Council to publish a mill strategy to inform site allocations and a development mill policy, which will look at a proactive approach to enabling effective reuse and specific mill engagement. Working with several authorities to discuss short and long-term reuse of key mill sites. Key engagement, for example, is being undertaken at Temple Works in Leeds, which is earmarked as the cultural linchpin as a possible British Library of the North. Issue 5 looks at industrial sites preserved as heritage attractions. This is the topic that Mike looked at earlier. As Mike said, we're looking at roughly 600 nationally designated preserved industrial sites accessible to the public in England. And for want of a better word, we've categorized these loosely as museums and monuments. And they're the public face of much of England's industrial heritage. But 2 commission reports in 1998 and 2008 highlighted issues around volunteer retention and recruitment, technical skills transfer from an aging volunteer base, adapting to a radically changing funding and visitor environment, achieving modern best practice conservation and management standards, and for those owned by local authorities, current financial pressures may create additional burdens. To the left is Queen Street Mill, where Lancashire County Council took the decision to close the site due to budgetary pressures. It's now reopened, whilst options are considered for its long-term future. And to the right, the Fakenham Museum of Gas and Local History in Suffolk, England's only surviving complete town gasworks, owned by National Grid, managed by a charitable trust, and we're working with both bodies to remove the site from the Heritage at Risk Register. As Mike said, the impact of COVID-19 has been particularly severe on these sites, resulting in temporary closure, loss of income, lack of maintenance, in some cases redundancies, and limited activities for the volunteers on which many of them depend. Some have received help through the government's Cultural Recovery Fund, the Crossness Engines Trust received on the right of the picture, Pending Community Heritage, who run Geaver Tin Mine down in Cornwall, the Arkwright Society at Cromford Mill, and a number of heritage railways. And John also mentioned Elsecar. Our response is a continued funding of the Industrial Heritage Support Office for England, again with the grateful support of the Association for Industrial Archaeology. Hosted by the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust, the Industrial Heritage Support Officer provides an advisory service, is creating industrial heritage support networks across the country to share expertise and knowledge, with full coverage to be completed by the end of the year, and is mapping the sector to guide what further help is needed as they recover from the pandemic. So to the left is the current state of play with the networks. Again, this is information kindly provided by Mike. As you can see, they're all up and running bar 2, and we've reconvened them remotely during the pandemic, but we'll be doing the East of England and Yorkshire by the end of the calendar year, so they'll all be in place then. And to the bottom right of the picture are the links to the 2 websites that Mike runs, one dealing with the Industrial Sports posts, one dealing with the networks, but of course he also does Facebook and Twitter posts as well. Moving on to Heritage at Risk, issue 6. I alluded earlier that large complex industrial sites, particularly those that survive as monuments, engineering structures, or retain kit, can present difficult and ongoing conservation challenges, and for some reuse options may be limited, such as Chatley-Whitfield Stoke-on-Trent, as we see here. This is the most complete example of a large-scale colliery in England, dating from the peak years of the industry. Here, we're working with Stoke-on-Trent, with Stoke City Council, the owner, the local MP, and the Friends of Chatley-Whitfield Colliery to prepare a future vision for the site. Some of you may recall that Chatley was one of the 10 key sites identified as part of our 2011 Industrial Heritage Risk Project. Significant progress is being made at a number of others. The Elsecar engine, which we heard about earlier, is no longer on the Heritage Risk Register. Battersea Power Station is being redeveloped. And as an organisation, we've acquired Shrewsbury Flax Mill Maltings, the first building in the world to have a fireproof internal iron frame. This major £28.4 million project involves a £20.7 million grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It will result in high quality office space on the top 4 floors of the main mill, which is seen to the left of the screen, and a new visitor experience and cafe on the ground floor. The project involves a heritage skills program supported by the Andrew Lloyd Webber Foundation with work-based placements, continuing professional development, site tours for students and those working in construction using the site as a tool for learning. The main mill and kiln, the kiln is on the right of the screen, are due to open in spring 2022. So do come and visit. Moving on to issue 7, knowledge and skills. As previously touched on, again, Mike alluded to this, there are few opportunities to develop skills and training in the understanding, conservation, redevelopment and management of England's industrial heritage. Our response was to deliver Helm and Heritage Practice training programs, with the first Helm event delivered at Wigan, as shown on the screen there. This is no longer possible at present due to the pandemic, so we're running a series of webinars which some of you may have attended. The 3 completed webinars have attracted an audience of just under 3,000 people, including online views, demonstrating a strong appetite covering topics such as the draft industrial heritage strategy, the work of the Industrial Heritage Support Officer, issues around planning and conservation, and enforcement powers. More are being planned, including those on mills later this year, and recordings of past events are available to view online on the Historic England website with a link shown to the right of the screen. Moving on to issue 8, research. As an organisation, Historic England and its predecessor bodies have helped to try to plug this gap by having a very strong record in undertaking research, both internally and commissioned, preparing advice and guidance, and high quality publications on England's industrial heritage, as shown on the slide here. To the left, we've got the listing and scheduling selection guides, which provide information on criteria for their possible designation and contain overviews on the history, development, and significance of particular industries. These can be supported by more detailed introductions to heritage assets for particular assets, especially where they've been little studied, as shown in the middle of the slide. And again, both of these link to theme 4 transport. We previously mentioned Sites for Historic Industries, which is supported by more detailed guidance. Top right, such as archaeometallurgy, guidelines for best practice. There's also guidance on archaeology and historic pottery production sites and archaeological evidence for glassworking. And we also do our own research, such as historic area assessment of Elsecar, or the Elsecar Heritage Action Zone, which John mentioned during his presentation. And again, all these are available and downloadable from our website. We also fund work, such as the research framework on the archaeology of mining and quarrying in England, prepared by the National Association of Mining History Organisations, top left. Many industrial titles are included in our informed conservation series of publications, bottom left, on the hat industry of Luton. And we also continue to produce high quality publications, such as the Archaeology of Underground Mines and Quarries in England by John Barnett in the middle, and Lynn Pearson's England's Cooperative Movement and Architectural History, bottom right. Both won the Association for Industrial Archaeology's prestigious Peter Neveson Award for Outstanding Scholarship in 2019 and 2021. Whilst David Dungworth's Glassmaking in England from the 14th to the 20th century was a joint winner of the 2020 AIA Publication Award, and further publications are in preparation. So this moves us on to issue 9, engagement and participation. I've highlighted the importance of groups such as the Greater Grimsby Ice Factory Trust and bodies like and the Chatterley Whitfield Friends of the Chatterley Whitfield Colliery, together with the many hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers who own, manage, and run England's industrial sites preserved as heritage attractions. As we've heard, they carry inspirational work with primary and secondary schools, both on and off site, often linked to STEM subjects, and universities, together with lonely groups tackling issues such as loneliness. And John and Tegman touched on some of this good work they're doing with relation to Elsecar. But if we go back to the 2011 Industrial Heritage Risk Public Attitudes Survey, 85% thought the industrial heritage should be valued and appreciated. Many would like to get more involved. But younger people are much less interested than those over 55, which perhaps brings us to one of the most challenging areas. Given the unique and international importance of the UK's industrial heritage, a heritage where almost every family's ancestors would have been involved in some capacity, how can we harness and grow public and political support? After all, our industrial heritage also provides a unique opportunity to enthuse and connect with members of the public who might not normally engage with heritage and the historic environment. And again, you might have thoughts on how we can channel this at the Q&A at the end. So I hope that gives you an initial flavour of the draft strategy. I also provide regular updates through LinkedIn, where the 44 industrial heritage posts thus far have attracted around 44,500 views. So that's me, Mike. Back to you.
Thank you, Shane. If you could unshare your screen, that's brilliant. We've made it through to the end of the morning. Are there any points or questions that the audience would like to ask Shane, I noticed in the group chat somebody reminded us that the Fakenham Gasworks is in Norfolk. So,
oh, sorry, yeah, slip of the tongue there. Apologies.
yeah.
Second time you've done that.
Yes. And Tegwin raised the issue that at Elsecar they've found that the best way to engage young people is to talk to young people and ask them what they want and how we can work with them, which I think is absolutely spot on. And that's definitely something that I've seen from comments I've seen from other industrial heritage sites during lockdown, particularly in the industrial heritage network groups, where we've raised those issues. And there's some good questions. There's some good examples of engagement with young people in South Wales. This is really an unfair question, which I don't think Shane is in a position to answer because he's been on holiday for 3 weeks. Graham Collett raises the issue of Redcar Coal and Steelworks. So, Shane, I'm going to absolve you from answering that. You've been on holiday for 3 weeks, and I know I know you haven't seen it across your desk. I'm only a humble council member of the AAA, but I would observe that it's not best practice to have something provisionally listed and then delisted within 5 days. And it's very depressing to see the local regional mayor in Teesside call that particular industrial monument a pile of mouldering concrete that cuts across everything that Shane's just talked about this morning. And I'm sure the AIA president, Professor David Perrett, will have something to say on Redcar in due course. It is, but I would also remind the audience here this morning that we can take the political problems of industrial heritage and archaeology right the way back to the Euston Arch in the early 1960s. So industrial heritage is not a stranger to those kind of decisions for demolition being done at the drop of a hat. So yeah.
What I will say, as Mike says, I've been on 3 weeks holiday. I've got another week left, so I'm not up to speed with this at all. But once I'm back at work, I will be finding a little bit more about this case.
Thank you, Shane. Yeah, but any other comments from this morning, either for Shane or for anything else? We've pretty much kept to time, which is good. Bill, as webmaster, do you want to come in there?
I don't have much to add, except to say that I shall be leaving the meeting room open as we roll forward into this afternoon's session, so you don't have to disconnect. But if you do disconnect, I'll be readmitting people from 2 o'clock, if not earlier. So stay with us. Certainly we'll look forward to seeing and hearing from you later on.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. And so I'm going to bring this morning's discussion to a close in that case. I just want to thank all our speakers. Somewhat ironic that it was the first presentation by myself which had the internet problems, but there you go. That's what we have to deal with in this online world. This afternoon, the lead is being taken by our young members board. And as Bill says, the room is open and we'll be gathering from 2 o'clock for 2:30. So I hope to see many of you back this afternoon at 2:30. And it may well be that some of the issues we've talked about this morning, and who knows, maybe even Redcar might crop up in discussions this afternoon. Otherwise, can I say thanks to everybody for turning up this morning. Thanks to Bill for managing things, and to our speakers. So have a good lunch, and I will see you all back here this afternoon. Thank you very much, everybody.